Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the ASCA 2013 webinar series. Today's installment is the ASCA National Model Accountability with our presenter, Dr. Julie Hartline. Before we get started, I wanted to touch on a couple technical sides of this webinar. The first thing is, when you joined, you should have heard that you are in listen-only mode. What listen-only mode means is that you aren't going to be able to talk during the webinar. But it doesn't mean that we don't want your questions and your comments throughout the presentation. On the right-hand side of your screen, you should have a menu, and within that menu, there's a section that is called Chat and Questions. Please feel free to put any questions you have there. In addition, I will post links to where you can view this webinar later. And because we are recording the webinar, so if you have to step away from your computer, if you miss part of the webinar, if you show up late, whatever it is, we will make sure that we get you a link to the webinar. It's all housed on the ASCA website, so you will have to go there to get it. In addition to the recording, we'll also post a PDF version of the PowerPoint. Now I'd like to introduce our presenter, who is Julie Hartline. Julie graduated from Agnes Scott College in 1988 with a Bachelor's of Arts in Latin and Psychology. She entered the field of education in 1991 after serving as a parole officer in Atlanta, Georgia, and discovering that over 85% of her caseloads had not completed high school. She received her master's in school counseling in 1998, her educational specialist in school counseling in 2006, her leadership certification in 2009, and our educational doctorate in professional counseling and supervision in July 2011. Julie is the school counseling and advisement consultant for the Cobb County School District in Marietta, Georgia. She served as the chair of the Campbell High School Counseling Department for 14 years, where her department became one of the first high schools in the state of Georgia to receive the recognized ASCA model program, which is called RAMP Award, from the American School Counselor Association in 2008. Julie was named the 2009 ASCA School Counselor of the Year. She served as a RAMP reviewer for ASCA from 2009 to 2012 and is now a lead RAMP reviewer. She is presently the advocacy chair for the Georgia School Counselors Association and the Cobb County School Counselors Association. She is the 2013-2014 president-elect of the Georgia School Counselor Association. Julie is passionate about the field of school counseling and the difference comprehensive school counseling programs make in the lives of students. She enjoys training school counselors in her district, state, and around the nation on the ASCA National Model and the RAMP application process. So now I'm going to pass it on to Julie.
Hello, and thanks for being with us today. I'm really excited to talk to you about the accountability piece of the national model. I want to start this afternoon by sharing something that I created that I call the ASCA National Model Home. If you take the four systems of the model and you think about them as a house, I think this example works really well, that your foundation piece is there to support the entire program. Your delivery system serves as your walls, and then you have your roof, which is your management and your accountability. And I like this example because, to me, the foundation is oftentimes the part of the model that people may not see, whereas the delivery system happens to be the pieces that people see you out and about doing with and for students. And then the roof, which protects the house from the elements, is that management and accountability. So it's those pieces that we have to put into place to preserve our school counseling programs. If you take this a little bit further, you can see the different pieces that fall in each category, you know, with the foundation having, again, those beliefs and vision and mission, goals, competencies, our ethical standards, those things that people may not see or really understand, but then, like I said, that delivery system being the things that people see you doing, your core curriculum, your individual planning, your responsive services, and the indirect services. And then those roof pieces, which go back to those calendars and advisory council and our lesson plans and that data analysis. And I built the themes into, the sky and into the windows of the home, and then I put a pool in there today that we're going to talk about, the data pool. And I think that's one of the neatest parts about the model is the data pool, because part of it, I guess, is I'm a little bit of a geek, but I also think the data shows the difference that you make for students, and that to me is really exciting. So they've asked me to cover the accountability piece with you, and I wanted to start by just kind of showing you the difference between the second edition and the third edition, which came out this past summer. And you can just see the slight differences, and there aren't big changes here. There are still those results reports and the audit, which has a new name, and we're going to kind of walk through all of these different pieces. But there are some minor tweaks in this piece, and so I will kind of cover those as we go through and show you the parts that are new in the third edition. So the first piece is that data analysis, and that incorporates two things that are new: the school data profile analysis and a use of time analysis. And we're going to spend just a few minutes kind of looking at those and talking about those. The school data profile really allows you the opportunity to look at trends in your data over a 3-year period. This template, I think it's a great tool, whether you're in the middle of a comprehensive program or if you are starting a comprehensive program. If you're starting your program, it can really help to highlight places where your school may be in need, where you need to target specific students. It can do the same thing for you if you're in the middle of your program, but it can also show you where there may have been growth since you implemented your program. So I really think this is a great new tool that ASCA has developed that allows you to really have your finger on the pulse of what's happening with the data in your school. And a lot of schools already have plans like this. They may be your strategic plan, but this is, a really simple format that I think allows you to see things very quickly and very easily. That is so important because you have to use your school's data to determine what your annual goals are going to be for your school counseling program, and then to measure those outcomes, which is all a part of that accountability, to see if you've met those goals or not. And so I think this template really helps to provide some structure for that. The other piece of this part is the use of time assessment. And this is just a way for you to make sure that you're spending your time in an appropriate way as a school counselor. And I really like this new template because it, in the delivery system where they've now differentiated direct student services and indirect student services, and we'll kind of talk a little bit about that in a little while, not that that's really the focus of today, but I think this is a great tool for you to see where the different things that you're doing fall, and then to what non-counseling tasks you may be spending your time on. And this is a part of accountability because you want to make sure you're spending your time appropriately as a school counselor, but it's also such an incredible advocacy tool. If you are spending the majority of your time in non-counseling tasks, it's much more meaningful to go to your administration with some figures and with your log to show them that that is what's happening, rather than saying I'm spending all my time doing X, Y, and Z. Working with school counselors in my district, I hear that all the time, and when they sit down and actually do a week's time assessment, or maybe they'll do 1 day a week for a month, and then they go and they share this data with the administration, it a lot of times brings about change. One school in particular, a counselor kept saying, I'm spending all my time in the record room, and the principal was not responding at all. And so she did the time assessment and then went in and met with him and showed him the data in black and white. And within a week, they had gotten some clerical help to come and help out. So I really think this is a great accountability tool for us as school counselors. I wanted to kind of stop for a second and talk about the time comparison between the second and the third model because I really think the changes work for different schools. Now we're still, want to provide the curriculum and the individual student planning and the responsive services, but instead of having the recommended percentages of time, we're being asked to spend 80% or more of our time in direct services or indirect services. And I think that's an important change, and I think it's going to make a big difference for our accountability piece, because I know from working with different levels in different schools, if some schools had parent populations that were highly involved, they oftentimes had a difficult time falling within the recommended percentages of time, whereas the new edition allows you more flexibility to spend 80% or more either face-to-face contact with students or through indirect services with others on behalf of students. And those contacts with others may not be face-to-face. They may be phone, they may be email, they may be referral forms you're filling out. So it allows more flexibility to meet the needs of your school. And I think that's going to be an important piece as we collect data and are accountable for how we're spending our time. The second part of the accountability piece is program results, and there are several pieces to this. The data that we're collecting as school counselors hasn't changed. It's still the process data, the perception data, but what did change in the third edition is the terminology. It's no longer being called results data as the third component. It's being called outcome data. And if you look at these, they're the same. Process are numbers impacted, perception is pre-post and surveys, and then that outcome data is achievement, attendance, and behavior. So it's just a terminology change, but still the same types of data that we're collecting. I want to look at these in a little more detail with you. When we talk about process data, you're basically talking about looking at if something happened or not, if it was conducted, if you set out an action plan of how you were going to do things for the year. It's just a way, an accountability piece to know, did this actually occur? I like to think of process data as the type of data that does not tell you anything about how kids are different. We've been collecting this kind of data for a very, very long time, but it doesn't tell us anything about whether kids are different or not based on what we're doing. Some examples of process data are things like 8 fourth grade students participated in a group. A group met 6 times for 45 minutes. 450 ninth graders participated in these lessons. 38 parents attended a meeting. So again, nothing about how anybody is different or anything that they learned, just that something occurred. Then we have that perception data. This has to do with the changes in attitudes, beliefs, and knowledge. So based on your interventions and your activities, how are attitudes, beliefs, and knowledge different as a result of that? And if you look at our standards, it's the attainment of those competencies that lie within our standards. Some examples of perception data would be things like 100% of your 6th graders can identify 3 careers of interest. 89% of your students know promotion and retention criteria. 92% can identify early warning signs of violence. 93% believe fighting is not an appropriate method of solving problems. 69% report feeling safe at school, or 90% of the parents report benefiting from a presentation. So some of these, I think you can report just as one-sided data, but a lot of times with perception data, I think you want to be careful to include some kind of pre-data and post-data. So if you report out that 69% of the students report feeling safe at school, if you were reporting pre and post intervention, as the person reading that or hearing that, I would want to know what percentage was at the beginning of your intervention and what was at the end. Now, not all of these, would you have to do that, because sometimes just embedded in the activity itself, like if you took your sixth graders into the lab and you have them identify 3 careers of interest, obviously they didn't have any careers of interest identified through whatever program you're working to start with. But so sometimes with perception data you want to give a pre and a post, sometimes not necessarily. So if you look at some ways you might get at your perception data, pre-post obviously is one that can show you, what did they learn? Did their perspective change? Maybe, they didn't think knowing something was important or having this information mattered to them, and they realized after the fact that it does. It might be a needs assessment. So you might be looking at the perceptions of students or what people think your program needs. It might be that you do some kind of evaluation. It might be some type of survey. And it really, as I've worked with counselors, this is a piece that I think we struggle with, and all educators are struggling with, because now as there's more and more accountability, we're having to learn to measure as we go along. And there's not, you have to really look at the intervention you're providing or the activity you're providing, and you have to determine what the best type of perception data could be attached to that. So there's not a black and white one way to do this. It's something that we're all working with, and it's a paradigm shift in my mind and a skill set that we're learning. The third type of data, which is what was formerly known as results, is the outcome data, and it's really that ultimate goal. Some people call it the so what data. It's that they took whatever knowledge they gained or whatever attitude or skill they gained, and they actually applied it. It's the hard data, the things that will get the attention of your board, your principal, your administration, your community. I like to think of it as the big ticket items. And it's really the students taking that perception data piece that you've given them through your activity and intervention, applying it, and it will impact those big ticket items of attendance, behavior, or academic achievement. Looking at some examples for outcome data would be things like promotion rates increasing, attendance increasing, discipline referrals decreasing. So these are just some examples for that. I want to take a minute to kind of look at 4 examples here and to talk about these, and I've made something over on the side to kind of be as a guide for you for the 3 different kinds of data. Remember that process data, I have the no change, because process data doesn't tell you how anybody is different, so there's no change there. Perception data is that middle piece, and outcome data is the big ticket item. And when I work with counselors, I try to help them to think about data, big ticket items, no change, and everything in the middle is that perception data piece. So as we look at these examples here, and we talk about 40% fewer discipline referrals, okay, or if our big ticket items are achievement, attendance, and behavior, this is clearly a big ticket item. It's something that's going to get people's attention, so this would be outcome data. The second one, 400 students, I have no idea how anyone is different, so that would be the no change data, the process data. The third one, 45% feel safe at school. I know that they're, I'm assuming that I'm doing something pre and post, and that 45% was before and after, so there is some change, but it's not that big ticket. It's not attendance, it's not behavior, it's not achievement. Now, because they feel safe, that should impact that outcome data, but this is perception data. And then the fourth example here, I think, is probably the one that counselors struggle with the most. If you think about this, there's a key word in this statement that really helps to define what kind of data this is. 100% developed a graduation plan. It doesn't just say 100% had a graduation plan. If I just said 100% had a graduation plan, I may have sat in my office and written all these plans myself, in which case there would be no change for kids. But in this scenario, 100% of my kids developed. So there is some change for kids. They've developed this plan. then a lot of people want, so I know it's not process data, so it's either perception or outcome. A lot of people want to go to that outcome data, but I want you to stop and think, what's the big ticket item related to a graduation plan? It's either graduation or it's promotion rate. So this is perception data. It's that middle piece. I had a colleague who used the analogy of Weight Watchers. She said, Julie, if I want to lose weight and I join Weight Watchers, I haven't actually lost the weight, which would be the outcome, the big ticket item. But I've done something in the meantime. I didn't just stay at home on my sofa. I actually went and joined Weight Watchers. So it's that middle piece. There was some change, so it's not that process data. So there's some change, but it's not that final outcome. And that's why this is perception data. I also think it's important for us as counselors to learn to do some math. I've sat in presentations where math teachers, and luckily it wasn't one that I did, it was a former principal of mine who talked about percentages, and the math teachers started correcting them. And so I think it's really important for us to learn how to do percentages accurately so that we gain respect from our teachers who, because some of them can be out there and, be looking critically, and that's what they get hung up on instead of the difference we're making for kids. And this is the David effect. I learned this from a Trish Hatch workshop back in 2005. It's a very simple 5-step way to calculate percentages of change. The first step is you take your pretest number correct, or whatever your starting number is. Then you have your final number. You take the final number and subtract the starting number. So you can see this example here, 286 was the end number minus 238. That gives you your change. So there's 48 is the difference. And then you divide that change by your starting number, and that gives you a decimal change. And then you move the decimal 2 digits to the right to get your percentage. So that would be a 20% increase. So if you had, if you were doing some type of intervention, and let's say, you were working with a group of 10 kids, and, pre-intervention, they had, I'm kind of, sorry, think about this off the top of my head. Let's say pre-intervention, they had 238 passing grades, and then post-intervention they had 286 passing grades. That would be 20% increase. Okay? Let's look at another example together. Let's say technology offenses. Let's say you identified from your school data profile that there were 47 technology offenses, and so you said, I'm going to do some kind of intervention with this group of kids that have these technology offenses. And so last year they had 47 technology offenses, and you do an intervention this year, and at the end of the year they only had 10. So you said, okay, well, I need to know what kind of growth I saw here. So you take that final number, 10, and you subtract the starting number, 47, and that gives you negative 37. And then you divide that change by the starting number. So negative 37 divided by 47 gives you negative 0.78. And then you move that decimal over, and because it's a negative, it's a decrease. So it would be a 78% decrease. So if you were reporting this data out to your faculty, or writing it up in a results report, or sharing it somewhere, this is how you would want to report these calculations to be mathematically correct. And I don't think it's too difficult. Once I used to look at this formula all the time when I started doing data, and now I know it. But, write it down somewhere and go back to it whenever you need it. But it's just a quick way to do the math. The other piece of the program results is taking that data that we collect and putting them into those results reports. And there are 3 types of results reports in the 3rd edition. One, the curriculum results report, it's not new, it's just new terminology. We've moved away from that guidance curriculum. We're moving away from even using the word guidance in our practice. because the link it has and the way it dates back to the history of our profession and how we were always assigned other duties. So we're trying to establish that we have a curriculum. It's a core curriculum. So these are curriculum results reports. They're not different than the previous model. The Closing the Gap results report, that's not a new piece. The small group results report, that is new for the model, but if you've applied for RAMP or looked at the RAMP application, that piece has been there. So although it's new within the 3rd edition, it's not really brand new for ASCA. I'm going to back up just a second because I want to, in all 3 of these would be activities and interventions that we as school counselors are providing. And we would collect data, and not to say that you have to collect data on everything you do as a school counselor. Please never think that. You can never do that. But you should be collecting some data related to the curriculum you're delivering. You should be collecting data related to your Closing the Gap interventions and your small group interventions. And collecting those 3 different kinds of data, the process perception and outcome data. What I did for my dissertation was I looked at Closing the Gap results reports, and I did an analysis of 100 of those. And what I want to do in this next part is share with you the rubric that I developed and the scores and some information that I learned from that, because I think it's a way to help us as school counselors as we become more comfortable with this accountability piece. So the rubric that I developed had 4 components. The first was if the actual Closing the Gap intervention was counselor-led. And what I meant by this was, and I scored the rubric on a scale of 1 to 3, 1 being not evident, all the way up to 3 being a proficient. And what I really meant by this was if a counselor were proficient in providing a Closing the Gap intervention, they would be the primary person to design and implement the intervention. If they were emerging or kind of growing in this area, they might participate in the intervention, but it might have been under the direction of someone else. Maybe their administration, maybe their school social worker was doing something and they participated. And then if they really weren't at this point, they may have collected data on an intervention that someone else did. So when I looked at this piece and the 100 reports that I looked at, the average score was a 2.84. Out of the highest score being a 3. So we really, as school counselors, for the most part, know how to do this. We know how to be the primary individuals to design and implement an intervention to close an achievement gap. The next part of the rubric talked about the identification of the achievement gap itself. And if you look at a 2 versus a 3, both of them have a gap being identified for a group of kids. The 3 says the gap is based on school data. And the 1, of course, has, not identifying a group of students for whom a gap existed. So when you look at the scores in just a second for the 2 and the 3, I think it's important to note that the 3 has to be based on school data. So if you look at what I found from my 100 reports, over 75% of us were able to identify a group of students for whom a gap existed, but only a little less than half of the counselors were able to utilize the data. And a lot of times this had to do with our comfort level with the data. And let me give you an example of the difference that I would be talking about here. If, for example, in a results report, you said you held a group for students who had attendance issues, I'm going to assume that this is a group of kids for whom a gap exists because they're not coming to school. But I don't know the specific data that you use to identify these kids. So I would have scored that report with a 2. But if you told me you identified kids who had 5 or more absences, then I know specifically what data you use to identify that group of kids who had the gap. So that's the difference in the 2 and the 3 here. So I think that has somewhat to do with us getting comfortable writing about the specifics of how we identified the kids that we're working with. The next component of the rubric had to do with the intervention itself. To get a 3 here, the intervention 1 had to address the need. It had to be based on one of our ASCA domains, academic, career, personal, social. The intervention had to be conducted over a sufficient period of time. If I went in and did something, and had one contact with kids, was that enough to actually, expect to close this achievement gap? And then the last piece, which was the piece that I found counselors probably struggled with the most, was that at the setup of the project, we needed to have a method or a way to assess the intervention based on perception and outcome data. So we needed to know when we set the project up, and this was not reporting the data out, it was when you set it up knowing this is the perception data I'm going to measure, this is the outcome data that I'm going to measure to determine if this intervention is successful. So you had to have both pieces. If you look at a 2, it could have been either or, and that's really what I found a lot of happening here was for counselors that were starting to get the data piece, they were doing one or the other. And part of the problem with one or the other is that people will a lot of times question if you just report out outcome data. And I'll give you a perfect example of this. I had the opportunity to speak to a group of board members from around the country, and they gave us like a minute and a half to do an intro, and I was talking about the graduation rates and how they had, at my school, and how they had been impacted by our program. And during the Q&A time, a board member stood up and asked, how do you know that your interventions made a difference to your graduation rate? Well, I had more time in Q&A, and I was able to say, well, because we also measured these changes in attitude, skill, and knowledge that, show that kids actually, there was a difference pre and post intervention, and then our graduation rates went up as well. Having that link to the outcome data satisfied the board member, and she sat down and she was okay. But if you don't have that link, a lot of times people will stop and question, well, how do you know you impacted that outcome data? And then the perception data piece, some counselors stop at that piece. They measure perception. They're okay measuring changes in attitude, skill, and knowledge for kids pre and post intervention, but then they're uncomfortable claiming a piece of that pie of the outcome data. To report outcome data is not to say that the school counseling intervention is the only factor that made a difference in it. You're just claiming part of it, and that's okay. So that's really what I saw here, and I'll show you the outcomes. You can see the average score went down to a 2.06, with more of us falling in that 2 category because we were either uncomfortable with both types of data, we didn't know how to measure both types of data, lots of different factors impacting that. But, and then even a third of us falling in the category of, not having all the pieces there that we need for the intervention. So again, I think this is a paradigm shift for school counselors, and it's something we have to get comfortable with in this day of accountability. The last section of my rubric had to do with the results themselves. And again, a difference between a 2 and a 3 being, could be the perception and or outcome data. So if you only measured one type of data, you definitely were going to fall in the 2. But if you look at a 3, it had to be clear perception and outcome data, logical conclusions based on that data, and then realistic future plans based on what you learned. And what I found in this section is that not only was the data a problem, but a lot of times we weren't comfortable going with that next step of what did the data tell us, and then what plans were we going to make based on that. The average score went even lower at a 2.01, and you can see here that of the 100 reports, only 12 had the categories for this section to get a 3. Most of the counselors fell in the 2 category, where they were, they had some data and they had some conclusions, but they just weren't as clear. And so this is something that we as counselors, need to work on as well. Now, what I found in working with counselors was helping them to understand these closing the gap results reports is to share some of the areas of concern that I found. And these were some of the ones that I came up with, and we're kind of going to walk through each of these, and I'm going to give you an example. But these were things that really impacted, their results reports and how effective they were. And I think these are so important because, again, this is an incredible advocacy tool. I'll share a personal story with you. In my state, we've recently been working with an Education Finance Commission and trying to reduce school counselor ratios. And there were senators and House representatives and superintendents and many different stakeholders on this commission. And when we were up there talking about the need to have more school counselors who provide comprehensive school counseling programs, the question was, what kind of data do you have to show us that, these kinds of programs make a difference? And I said, we have lots of different kinds of data. And they said, well, can you provide that? And I, said, absolutely. And I went back to ASCA, and I said, can you please give me the names of schools in my state who are RAMP certified? And I reached out to them for these results reports and gave them to the senator and to the rest of the members of this commission. And as a result, they came back with very favorable responses regarding what we were, asking. So I really think these are important advocacy tools, these results reports. And so, I want to spend a few minutes talking about these different problems that I saw. So when we talk about inappropriate counselor-led interventions, just to give you a couple of examples here, whether it's appropriate or inappropriate, the first one talks about a curriculum for reading comprehension. The second one talks about a biweekly group counseling session for anger management. I think it's important when we think about, is this an appropriate counselor-led intervention? And I've had counselors, talk to me about different things that they're being asked to do. And my question is always, are you uniquely qualified to provide this service for your kids? And it goes back to our standards. Academic being things like time management, organizational skills, personal social, and then career. And if you think about these two examples, the reading comprehension is not really an appropriate counselor-led intervention. We're not necessarily trained in reading strategies and reading instructing. But we are trained in personal social issues such as anger management and behavior issues. That is, the kinds of things that we know how to deal with. Now, I always want to put a caveat in here, because if your school has a school-wide initiative and everybody in the school is taking a group of kids and doing some kind of reading, I'm obviously not advocating for you to go to your principal and say, hey, ASCA said that I'm not supposed to do this. If everybody on your school team is doing this, you have to play a part of that. What I do recommend is if they'll let you choose the content of what the kids are going to read, that you pick something that is related to our curriculum. And then you can kind of, not only hit the strategies that you're working on for your school, but you can also, sorry about that, you can also, hit some of your curriculum as well. The next concern had to do with, at the onset of the intervention, did the counselors have a method of assessment with both perception and outcome data? And I took these examples straight from results reports, so I just kind of wanted you to see what was out there. So this piece right here is not about reporting the data out itself. It is about, when you planned the intervention, did you plan for a way to measure perception and outcome data? If you look at the first example, they have grades. That is a big ticket item. That's outcome data. And then they also talk about looking at changes in attitudes and beliefs about academic performance. That goes back to that perception data piece of, is something different for kids in their attitudes and beliefs about whether they need or want to be academically performing well. The second example talks about grades, disciplinary offenses, and attendance. All big ticket items, all important things. But what is missing in the second one is that perception data piece. Okay? Again, this is not the data being reported out. It is planning to measure the data. So in this case, the second one would be insufficient because you don't have a measurement for perception data or a plan for what you would measure for your perception data. The next concern had to do with, once you reported the perception data out, was it sufficient or not? And if you look at these two examples, I think one clear thing comes out to me when we talk about reporting out data. If you don't have numbers, it's hard to say there's data. So this first example says some views on attendance and CRCT scores changed. If somebody is reading this report, they don't really know what some means. But the second example talks about declines from 90 to 75%, increases from 50 to 80. These are actual numbers. Now, I might have wanted my results to be better than this, but it's still actual data. So the second one is a sufficient example of perception data being reported out, while the first one isn't. The next area of concern that I found was counselors reporting out information instead of that actual outcome data. Again, going back to the numbers. If there are no numbers there, it's really hard to consider it data. So the first one talks about 70% continue to get in evaluations. I wouldn't be happy with these outcomes. It would tell me something needs to happen differently with my intervention, but it's still data and it's still there. Whereas the second one is talking about, several students, some did not. That's information. We don't know where the actual data is. And I will stop here for just a second, because when I talk about the first example and wishing the outcomes were better, I think sometimes we're afraid of data because we're afraid it'll tell us that what we're doing isn't making a difference. And that actually happened to me the first thing I measured in my school. But I had to stop and ask myself, how long would I have continued to do that if I didn't know it wasn't making a difference? So I really try to stress to people that, a data-driven program sometimes tells you to do things differently. The next concern I looked at had to do with not basing your summary and conclusions on your results. If you look at the first example there, they talk about what their pre-post test results indicated, and then based on their pre-post test, what they found out. That is based on the actual results. Whereas the second one talks about the behavior improved for 2, but ongoing monitoring and support may be needed. And it may be, but if I'm talking about 2 of 3 students improving, what does this tell me about the one student who didn't improve? And do I need to continue an intervention if I have been able to work with students and they're making improvements on their own? So it's really not founded in the data that was there. And the final one had to do with the failure to address next steps based on what you learned. The first example talks about, based on the results, the program was unsuccessful. Okay, but what did those results tell you? And they go on to talk about they can't really do this program in the morning because the number of students who eat breakfast. And that might be true, but they needed to really explain to us that attendance at the groups or whatever showed that, and that this was their plan to change the intervention and do it at a different time the next year. Whereas the second example actually has some next steps. It says, given the success with the girls, they're going to do this next year with the girls and with the boys. So it's important that we look at, was it successful, and then where are we going to go next? The final piece of the third edition accountability has 3 sections: the school counselor competencies assessment, which is new, the program assessment analysis, which is revised, and the school counselor performance appraisal template, which is new. And I want to look at these very quickly with you. The first one is really a way for you to evaluate yourself, and do you have the knowledge, attitude, and skills you need to be a professional school counselor. It's just a checklist that you can go through and see where you fall. The second one replaces what used to be that program audit. And I really like this program assessment a lot because it takes the different components of the program and it lets you say, are they in place, are they not in place, are they in progress? Whereas the old audit required you to say where you were in your year of implementation, I think this is so much easier to do a quick check of where your school counseling program lies. And then the third piece of this is really a performance evaluation. Some of us don't work in districts that have a school counselor specific performance evaluation. We may be evaluated based on a teacher evaluation or some other type of evaluation. And this is a great tool to share with administration. Not that they necessarily may be able to use it if your district doesn't allow that, but it really can kind of help them to understand what it is you're supposed to be doing as a school counselor. So I really think it's a great tool that's been added to this accountability piece. And I am going to stop talking now and see if there are any questions for me.
We do have one question so far. And everyone, just as a reminder, on the right-hand side of your screen, you have a chat and question box. Please send your questions there. We do have roughly 13 minutes to answer questions, so please do send those. The first question is from Javora, and her question is, what is the best way to begin the implementation of the ASCA National Model into an LEA that is moving towards this model?
When I talk to school counselors and I talk about the best place to start, is really with a closing the gap intervention. It's the best way to get comfortable with the data component, because when you are looking at your data to identify a gap, it's something you can see is there. It's something that you can easily measure your impact, with that perception data and then the outcome data. And it's a good place to start to share the, what outcomes you had, and to start to advocate for how you're spending your time as a school counselor. When I talk to school counselors that are heavily spending their time in non-counseling duties, I'll say if you can just carve out a little bit of time to do some kind of closing the gap intervention, and if it's successful and you take those results with you to your administration and you have the conversation of, I was able to do this with these students, look at the outcomes, I would really like to spend more time impacting more students in this way. So how can we negotiate, because here's my time assessment, and clearly I'm spending my time over here, and we need to make some changes. That's a great place to start. I also think the management agreement is a good way to get started with that conversation with administration about how you're spending your time, and how you have to frame it around what you can do to impact student achievement in your school.
Okay, our next question is from Brittany, and she first asked if you could go back to the slide about the program assessment analysis.
Okay.
And then her question is, should this program assessment analysis be done by each counselor, or should it be done as a group?
This is a school counseling program assessment, so it really should be done as a group. You might want to have the different counselors complete it just because sometimes that may really open up some good conversation about one person may see that think you have already done something or it's in progress, and another person may see it as something that hasn't started at all. So that can be really valuable conversation for your department to have. But its overall purpose is to be a program assessment, not an individual counselor assessment. But I could see it being of value to have each person do it and then have a conversation and come to some kind of consensus about, what you as a group think.
Okay, the next question could be part of a RAMP application process, but also I think it may just be a general question from Leanne, and she's wondering if she would be able to send an end-of-the-year report that lists process, perception, and outcome data for feedback and suggestions or recommendations. And if yes, who do you think she should send it to?
I don't, Jeff, and maybe that's something you can answer from ASCA if that is, something that they provide feedback on. I know that when you go through the RAMP application process, you do get that feedback because your results reports are scored on the rubric. But if you're just starting off, I would advise you to go through the RAMP process just to get that feedback. So I'm going to kind of defer that question to ASCA, I guess, Jeff.
Right. I just wanted to make sure that I asked the question, and also, if that's a good idea to try to send it to someone. I think that probably the best place for Leanne for you to go is on the ASCA scene. There is a RAMP section, and you may want to, ask, has anyone gone through the RAMP evaluation process, and have a good idea? Could they take a look at my process perception outcome data end-of-year report? And that may be the best way to do it. Right now, that looks like all the questions we have. I do know, Kay, you have a question up there. I will respond to that for you in just 1 second. But if anyone else has any questions, we still have a few more minutes that we have Dr. Hartline on. I'm sure that you'd be more than willing to answer any questions you have. So we'll give everybody just 1 minute to send in any other questions.
And while we're waiting for that, Jeff, I'll just, just to share with you all, I said at the beginning I'm kind of a data geek, but it was so powerful for me. It was the tool, the accountability piece was the tool that really transformed my school counseling program. And in the end, the data is about how kids are different. And I mean, that is so meaningful, and so it became such an integral part of my school counseling program and my department and the conversations that we had with regards to, whether we wanted to keep or change interventions. And so I really encourage you to not be scared of the data, because like I said, my first time out, I call it my crash and burn project because it did nothing. But I thought, and I had made this big deal in our newsletters about how we were going to measure our outcomes, and then I was like, wow, I'm now going to have to report to my faculty that this did nothing. And, I was really able to reframe it and say, but how much time would we have, we would have done that for years and years and years thinking we were making some kind of difference. And without that data, we never would have known that it wasn't really reaching our kids the way we needed to.
I'm sure everyone who's started this process can sympathize with you there.
And the other thing I will add is that when you start this process, please be patient with yourself. It's a 3 to 5 year process to build a comprehensive program. It doesn't happen overnight. And like I said, don't feel like you have to measure everything you do. You never will, but you especially won't when you first start out. Start with that closing the gap, start with the small group, start with the things that are easier to measure, and grow from there.
Okay, we do have one last question. This is going to be the last question we'll take, and it's from Cindy. And Cindy's question is, what about if you have a small group for data to report the outcomes, like 4 to 8 students? Would you do it the same way?
You absolutely do the same way. When you are dealing with a small group or closing the gap intervention, you're generally talking about a smaller group of kids, and you still report your data out the same way. And especially if you are trying to advocate to spend more of your time with kids, and you see that by providing this intervention for this small group of kids had positive outcomes, then you can use that to advocate, to do that more, within your program, but you still report out the same way.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining us today, and especially thank you to Dr. Hartline for a great presentation. I am putting up the link that you'll need to go to view the webinar recording after the fact. Please do give me 48 hours or so to get it posted online. So you should have seen that come through in your chat box. We do definitely appreciate everyone continuing to attend these webinars and learning from them. And once again, thank you to Dr. Julie Hartline for such a great presentation.
Thank you all so much.